Welcome to Adventist Voices, Spectrum's podcast. I'm Alexander Carpenter, and I'm honored to be joined by Dan Weber. Thanks so much for talking with us today.
Good to be here, Alex.
So, you and I were having a disagreement in this political season, and we thought that
Sure.
we would basically ruin other people's days by listening to us discuss this. And perhaps why don't you put it in your own words? What do we disagree about?
I think we disagree on the role that religious leaders, not just Adventist leaders, play when it comes to political endorsements of candidates. Is that good? Is that bad? Historically, what are the positions of the church? We'll talk about mainly the context of the Adventist Church, but we can look at the context of how that plays into historically with the formulation of the United States, and also with some longstanding discussions and debates back and forth, especially between Protestants and Catholics and other things like that. And where does Adventists surprisingly align on those issues? And then historically, we can kind of move towards the 50s when it became a much more prominent thing politically in the United States based on conversations that took place in the Civil Rights Campaign. And then how does that impact Adventists today? And then also, what is the role that Adventist members play when it comes to these conversations?
Great. Well, we'll see if we get to all of that.
Yeah.
But I think we're, the kind of overarching principle that we're interpreting, we both think we value separation of church and state. We think it's an important Adventist principle, a kind of larger humanitarian value. But what does it really mean, especially in a kind of, well, you say leader, I could even say on a campus community or
Sure.
in a church community,
Yep.
those kind of places where you have people who have a voice, they have a role, they have power. Let's be frank about that.
Well, they have influence, really. It's more
Sure.
important than anything. They have influence, yeah.
And then how do they use that? How should they use that? We're not saying, I think we're both recognizing there are laws against nonprofits taking
Yep.
political positions. So, of course, respecting those laws, that's a pretty clear barrier. Another one I'd say is I'd probably say that I wouldn't want, say, the General Conference president sort of offhand just throwing out, this is who everyone should vote for.
Yeah.
I think we both agree that's a bad
And
idea.
they cause some turmoil, yeah.
Yeah. But I think
But what does it mean? What does it mean for a local pastor?
Yeah. Or I would say a teacher. So maybe I'll ask you this just to be clear.
Sure.
I would, I think in a classroom, I would want to do my professional duty as an educator and sort of lay out in a fair way of a range of political positions. But there are professors who would kind of hide behind the position and say, it's really up to you to decide. I think as a professor, it's important to let students know what I think. And in that context, I would let them know who I'm voting for. But what do you think?
I don't. We have had conversations in my classroom about it this semester, especially because we have an election coming up next week.
I've heard,
There's a little bit of attention in the media about that. What I do is I try to make sure that my students are informed on both sides. I can and I tend to use humor and interject some of, statements about, like, I was just teaching a cinematography class and they were complaining about all the political ads they've seen on TV and how it's nothing but attacking characters. There's nothing about I stand for this, I stand for that. It's all negative, which is the trend in political ads these days. I even share with them that, and this is a personal thing, my wife and I don't share with each other who we vote for. We'll have conversations about it. We'll talk about it, but I don't want to place influence on, and if she asked me, I'd tell her, but I don't go and say, who did you vote for? That's her personal opinion. It's my personal opinion. I think everyone has the right. Everyone should be voting. Everyone should participate in the democratic process. And if you're not, my youngest daughter got to vote for the first time this year. And she went and voted early and sent me a picture of her pin, and she was all happy and stuff and everything. I don't want to know who she voted for, because sometimes, unfortunately, those conversations have turned so divisive these days that some ways, it can cause more harm than good. I will share with you this though. I teach a media ethics class. I teach that every spring. It's probably my favorite class to teach. And in that class, I teach my students, and I have writing students, photography, graphic design, communication students, even some non-majors take that class. But I tell them, you have two responsibilities. One is a producer of media, you have an ethical responsibility. And as a consumer of media, you have an ethical responsibility. And part of that ethical responsibility is understanding the media that you're consuming and the source that is providing it. Does that source have a bias? Whether it's a political bias or a religious bias or whatever, you have an accountability as a consumer of media to understand where that media comes from and the bias that may or actually is behind it. And we can use examples of CNN versus Fox and all these other things. They're all going to have a bend or a strong push towards one side or the other. And you have to understand who finances them, who owns them, and all these other things. And I encourage students to look at not just domestic media, but also international media as well. Look at the full context of the story before you make up your mind on something. You have to be informed. Don't just go with one side says, because we all tend to find we have bias. We have our own intentional bias or unintentional bias, but we gravitate towards media sources that inform that bias or push our fears even more so. And that's very intentional on advertisers and on content creators and media producers to push content out there that is going to play to people's fears. That way you're pushing an agenda, you're pushing someone down a road, and that's an unhealthy thing that unfortunately has permeated our politics now as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point to recognize. Maybe let's take from there that concept of kind of critical analysis, which you're really encouraging your students to do. I do, this is where I do disagree. I talk about not only who I'm going to vote for, but, my wife and I know who we're voting for, and we even get down into the weeds of certain local initiatives. Some we agree on, some we don't.
Right.
So I disagree on that. And I do think in the classroom, it is, again, without making it an uncomfortable space for disagreement. I think the real treasure of a good educational environment is to really help people analyze and then to engage critically. So the danger is someone just saying like, this is the voice of God, you have to listen to what I'm saying. And of course a professor has power in that situation. But just to make sure there's a pretty clear line here as we're kind of working our way through this issue, I think the danger is that professors will sort of passive aggressively imply what the correct place to pop out on their intellectual journey is. Yeah. And if you're subtle or if you're cool with the professor, then you're going to get the real, Freudian analysis is lame. I'm really into some sort of reader response theory or something like that. So I think what I like is a sort of upfront approach where at least you know where the professor's coming from, and you can sort of judge from there. The tricky thing is, I think, when you go, kind of go up the administrative ladder there. So how do you feel about like a chaplain indicating who they're voting for? Do you think that is dangerous on campus? Is it
I think anytime
separation of church and state principle?
There's a separation of church and state thing. There's also, are you going to be alienating one element of students that may disagree with you? This whole conversation kind of started because you said that one person in that role had put out something that would be supportive of one candidate, and my response to you was, flip that. What if that person came out and supported the other candidate? You guys would be up in arms about that. So, there has to be a fair balance there. The other thing is I think that religious leaders, whether you're a chaplain or a pastor or even even professors to some extent, but they have a little more leeway because of the academic part. Um, yeah, you have to be careful because you have a level of undue influence, and I think you can. Unfortunately, you can put your constituents in an uncomfortable place. And I'll refer to example when Ben Carson ran for president, and my office was tasked with managing that for the North American division. I was communication director at the NAD at the time, and we put a statement out immediately within 1 hour of Carson announcing he was running. We knew he was going to run, and we referred to Ellen White's comments that members individually should definitely take part in the religious process, or sorry, the political process, but that we were requesting leaders not to speak from the pulpit either pro or against Dr. Carson running for president. And because we realized that that was such a divisive issue that, not a majority, but a high number of our members were for him and another percentage were against him, that could very quickly, especially mixed congregations, could cause some divisiveness. And we didn't really want that from the pulpit. So we reinforced the church's opinion and strong endorsement of separation of church and state and not endorsing the political candidates. Did we think that this was going to stop every church from doing it? No, we were realistic and knew that wasn't going to happen. What I would say to if a pastor wanted to like have a local politician come in and speak at church, I'd say that's fine, but provide the same opportunity to his opponent. Have an open conversation. Don't just have it be we're just endorsing this one side. That's where I think you have to be cautious. But you're probably going to disagree with me on that.
Yeah, so I would. Yes, I think in the discussion that we had, I thought that we got to be careful about that kind of both sides. We want to think about what they represent. So I would say, let's say if it was 1996 and somebody wanted to invite Clinton
right
to speak, inviting Bob Dole, great, that kind of makes sense. But would you if you were the head elder, would you be comfortable if your pastor said, I'm going to invite Trump to speak at the local church, and we're going to try it, and we'll get Harris to come as well? Is that the kind of both sides that you're talking about?
I would look at the greater thing and say, are you introducing a media circus you don't need for your church? And is this really going to be a helpful conversation? No, it's not. So you shouldn't do that. I refer my students back. I'm actually teaching a public speaking class, and we're starting debate or persuasion speeches tomorrow on Wednesday. And one of them said, is there because some of them I had them watch the first debate between Trump and Harris. And one of them said, is there a debate I can actually watch that's actually valid? And I said, go watch the debate between Romney and Obama back in 2012. And there's a time in there where Obama misspoke. And Romney said to him, Mr. President, did you mean to say that? I don't think you meant to state that. He let him correct himself. And so while they could disagree on issues, there was a cordiality and there was a respect factor there. I mean, go look at some of the debates between Nixon and Kennedy. People on very divergent sides when it comes to issues, but yet there was a respect factor there. But I think that respect factor has been lost. Politics in the last 12 to 15 years in this country has become so toxic that just say the word politics right now and people immediately want to put their wall and their barrier up.
Yeah.
Because they're just done with it. They're frustrated. You can't have a valid conversation these days. And my point to you would be, is that really going to do anything to further a political conversation or a conversation about what is best for people? You want to inform both sides, but that would just be to use the term, that would be a dumpster fire that you wouldn't want to have in a religious environment.
Since we're telling stories, I'll share a story. When I was undergrad on your campus there at Andrews,
Careful, don't hurt yourself. You get a reputation.
As an alum now, all those times on the campus, it was beautiful. I saw a picture one of the student movement editors took, and it was like the colors are so beautiful back there, and it's a magical place. It was the Iraq War ramp up, and I had done a debate.
Is this the second Iraq War? or
Yeah,
the
this
first
was
one?
2000. This was early 20 or early 2003.
2003. Okay. I was on campus when the first one
Okay,
happened.
nice. Well, I we did a debate, and it really got folks talking on campus.
Sure.
It felt like there wasn't really there wasn't a lot of life on campus around social issues, and this
Hmm.
really provoked folks to really engage with this political issue at the time. And a part of that was just after 9/11, there were just
Yep.
kind of a sort of singular vision for what America could be. So anyway, I reached out to the dean of the College of Arts
Hmm.
and Sciences at the time, Bill Richardson, and said that at the student movement we wanted to basically get faculty and staff who wanted to sign on to a statement opposing war from an Adventist non-combatancy perspective.
Sure.
And he gave me, or let me say it this way, I gave him the thing, and then he sent it to the entire faculty and staff email list, inviting them to sign on to this statement that would appear in the student
Well,
movement. I'm an undergrad. Thank you for supporting us.
yeah.
He told me he got a lot of backlash for that. It was his choice, and he, as far as I understood, didn't change his mind on that. And we had a huge turnout, and we printed all those names in the student movement in a centerfold thing with all the faculty and staff who opposed the Iraq War.
Yeah.
And it got people talking on campus, as you can.
Sure.
Now,
But did you see that as a political conversation?
oh yeah, of course. Yeah, it's
You
a
think so?
conversation. Yeah, about opposing the
Okay.
Iraq War. Yeah,
Sure.
it was. We were in the minority as far as the sense was on campus. At least
Yeah.
we did a debate. I can back that up with numbers. We did a debate called "Why Whack Iraq." It was Bjorn Karlman, who works with Adventists Today now, and me. I was a senior. He was a junior, and we smartly debated two lower classmen, sophomore and a freshman. And we hosted it at Nethery Hall 10, 15 minutes before we started. The classroom was completely full. So we
Yeah.
moved to basically a space that could handle, we moved 3 times to a space that could handle over about 250 people.
Yeah.
And we polled everyone, just, hands, and then quick, somebody counted.
Yeah.
And it was about 50-50 on pro or anti, in that just self-selecting people who came to the debate. We did move some of the anti people or pro people anti the Iraq War after the debate, so that was fun.
Good.
And it was
No, I'm sorry. I wanted to counter, but go ahead and finish.
yeah, no, I just want to go back to the Bill Richardson anecdote and say there's somebody who had used influence on campus
Yes.
to do something that he got backlash for, but at the same time, I think it was healthy for the campus to kind of see, okay, these people, I wouldn't have known that a faculty member over in the seminary was opposed to the Iraq War, but it was helpful to kind of understand where people were at.
But I see that as a conversation on an issue and not as much as an endorsement of a candidate. And I think issues we have to talk about. We have to feel free to talk about them. My only point was that, let's say, if you had 20 people against the war and you had 3 people for the war, are those 3 people going to be willing to enter into a valid conversation if they're feeling overwhelmed by this one issue? Are you ostracizing them when you could maybe actually convince them the other way, but they may not engage? And I think that's part of the problem with what we tell pastors is, if you go to the pulpit and you endorse a candidate, are you suddenly telling the people in your congregation that may not like that candidate that their opinion is invalid? That's the challenge, because it can, we talk about separation of church and state and taxes and all this other stuff and government. That's good, and there's a strong reason behind that when you look at our eschatology and everything. But you have to go down to the personal side of it. Are you making one of your parishioners uncomfortable by endorsing a political candidate from the pulpit? Are you creating an environment they may add a semblance of disunity? We're not talking about an issue per se. We're actually talking about a full candidate. But this is, we could talk about some of the candidates today on, civil rights or on human rights issues have horrible records. But, and that's, I think, what we're going to disagree on. At what point is it you're speaking to a civil rights or a human rights issue, or are you actually just speaking against a candidate? And there's a gray area there where I think the church and religious leaders have to be careful.
So this is something I think we do agree on, and there's almost a pastoral heart to what you just said there that I really admire.
And I'm not a pastor, so
yeah, I know. Well, some people just have that gift, and I think caring about the three people who might feel ostracized is very important in my mind as well. But I would probably escalate that a little bit up to thinking about what the candidates we're talking about, what their policies do, or what their message does as well, the culture around them. And to really get down to brass tacks here, I am supporting, you won't probably reveal who you're supporting, but I will be voting for Vice President Kamala Harris for president. And I do think that I'm doing that, and, sharing that is not to make someone feel bad, but for voting for that person is also because I think the policies of the other candidate would be demonstrably harmful to lots and lots of people, and that candidate actually is not concerned with those three people. Yeah. In fact, there's a kind of punitive approach to anyone who would oppose him. So that's in the context that I'm kind of coming from when we're talking about this.
I think the issues part is important. When I was talking to my students today, they pled and they said, we just want to hear people talk about issues. We don't want to hear you saying all the negative stuff about the other person and the stuff and all the making stuff up and everything. We just want to hear how they feel about the issues. That's what matters to them. Mm-hmm. And we just don't, politics isn't that way anymore. When they had the debate, last month, the moderators tried to bring up issues, but there was never any real back and forth. It was deflection, which, some of them are very, very good at that. In fact, we teach that as a communication skill, especially when you work your PR and stuff and everything. We teach you the art of deflection. But there are times people want to hear answers to questions on it when it comes to issues, and we're not hearing any answers to issues, questions on issues.
Well, we're not hearing it, but it's not that hard to go to the Harris for President campaign website and read all you want.
You're going to put the URL on the screen just so everyone knows how to get there.
The thing about wow, geez, she didn't talk about issues in a short debate is always mind-boggling to me because
she wasn't able to because. But she wasn't able to because there was no real conversation there. There was no real debate. It was just mudslinging, and you can't. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Just
the both sides thing. We have a candidate who's sort of a very serious person who has worked in multiple governmental roles and thought through issues and enforced those issues, and then we have someone else. There's a
reality TV star. Yeah.
Yes. So there's a reason. I just don't. I always want to make sure that we understand that we can't. And I understand why this happens, and I'm not saying anyone's perfect here at all, but Kamala has her own sort of communication issues. She's not, she's not a Barack Obama in terms of sort of setting forth.
Well, look back at the Democratic debates that took place in 2020. She dropped out fairly quickly. She was not the best debater.
Well, yeah.
I mean, she was. And I will tell you, historically, I have voted Republican. Historically, all right, everything.
Okay.
And I will tell you a guy I would vote for in a heartbeat who's not running for office is Mayor Pete.
Oh, okay.
I really like him a lot. And I think he's got some really good things to say. I think he's moderate enough, but I think he also stands up for issues and stuff and everything. And
You
I
think
have
it's
good
because
friends that would think,
is that because he's
what?
up there in Michigan living in Traverse
No,
City?
that doesn't matter to me. I don't care where you live. I don't care,
I just
and
thought,
other people would have a problem with him because of his
orientate.
identification and other things, orientation and stuff like that. To me, it seems like he just has his head on straight. So, that's the most important thing is a politician have their head on straight and can they make valid decisions? So,
Yeah,
yeah,
the thing is, I'm not always looking for a great communicator. We're lucky when we get them. It's
yeah.
definitely how our politics is sort of how we digest a lot of our politics. But a good decision maker, a good collaborator, those sort of things are also maybe it doesn't show up during a debate, but you definitely want someone who knows how to take executive function when they're president.
So if you look at the shift in society that happened after World War II, and I teach this in my ethics class, we shifted from where we focused on character ethics. What was the morals of that person? And after World War II, we shifted where we focused on personality ethics. Are they a good public speaker? Do we like them up front? Are they presentable? Are they popular? Those types of things. Those are the people we gravitate towards. We tend not to uphold people that have moral values and do good things. They're not viewed as highly in society anymore, and it's gotten worse over the years. Where it's are they popular? How many followers do they have, and those types of things like that. But are they actually a good leader, or are they a good moral character? We don't look at those things anymore as a society, and I think we're paying for that.
Yeah, yeah. It's since you're bringing up presidential history, I mean, so many of those, especially during the sort of robber baron Gilded Age, you
Yeah,
have people who are literally just installed into the presidential office to basically to serve
yeah,
certain interests, and I think that has not changed at all. Um,
no, no.
it's
I
just how they're marketed in many ways is what's changed.
I think the conversation on separation of church and state, unfortunately, when Trump was president, he had an executive order that kind of he told the IRS not to enforce that anymore and to kind of cut the legs out from
Yeah,
underneath it, which opens the door for Christian nationalism and other types of things, which is something that Adventists have fought hard against back to the very beginning. Um, you and I were reading an article by Eric Syme that was actually published in Spectrum in 1973 that refers back to the early beginnings of the Adventist Church. And I knew I was going to have to do this, but there was the National Reform Association, which was founded in 1863, the same year the Adventist Church was founded, that was very much a Protestant move that was anti Catholic. And they
yeah,
were trying to clean up America after World War II. I'm sorry, after the Civil War, I apologize. After the Civil War. And they were actually looking to install Sunday laws because there was the perception that Catholics went to church on Sunday morning, but then they went and hung out in the bars on Sunday afternoons and were immoral. So let's close all the bars on Sundays, which then turned into a movement. In fact, there was a movement for a national amendment to install Sunday laws to close all businesses on Sundays, which the Adventist Church fought heavily against. So it's kind of funny. The Adventist Church sided with the Catholics, against the Protestants on this one thing because of the
Catholics
wanting to put
and the saloon
and
owners.
the saloon owners. Yes, yeah. And so there's in the same document, even the same article actually said that the Adventist Church was against Lincoln because Lincoln was more about the unity of the Union and not about freeing the slaves.
Yeah,
And so, people, we say this a lot, but the Adventist Church was heavily founded by abolitionists.
yeah,
So the Adventist Church has a long history in this, uh, in speaking out on issues of religious liberty. And a lot of it is self-serving to protect our own rights. But we also do it recently. We stand up for the rights of others. I remember there was the case, and I can't remember the name of the case, of the young lady who wanted to wear the headscarf
yeah,
working at Abercrombie and Fitch, and she was fired for it. And so we filed an amicus brief on her behalf, and she won her case. And our amicus brief was cited by the Supreme Court.
yeah.
So, there are times we stand up for the religious rights of others and not just our own self-interests.
Yeah, I think that's a commendable direction for
Yeah.
the denomination. And I think it's very appealing to Adventists. It gets to something that's, I think, good in the Adventist soul. Let's talk a little bit about separation of church and state as we're kind of
Sure.
moving along here. I think that that's often been misinterpreted by
Sure.
folks because they think there needs to be a kind of wall between my political views and my involvement in the Seventh-day Adventist Church,
Yep.
and I disagree with that. I think that we need
Yep.
to kind of tear down and think I think it literally happens in some local communities where Adventists have a wall between themselves and the community. They're not involved in the local
Yep.
rotary. They don't go and march against violence in the streets. They really aren't involved in kind of improving the local community, and it's no wonder that no one comes to their Daniel and Revelation seminar because they don't know who's there.
Right.
So I
Right.
think that separation of church and state concept is something that is really important to define. It comes out of Europe, and it comes out of this idea of a state-run church. And it wasn't just in America, but you had in Northern Europe a movement called the Free Church movement, in which you had people who were Lutheran but just didn't want to be part of the Lutheran state church. And that allowed Adventist missionary efforts, if they could be seen as free church, another type of free church. And that's actually been helpful. It's what some of our religious liberty leaders like Ganoon Diop have helped to facilitate, is to really help and William Johnson have conversations with kind of what you might call mainline churches or state
Yeah.
churches, and help them understand that Adventists are not a sect, they're not a cult, that they're just a type of a free church. So I think that that's an important point to recognize, that Adventists have just been very concerned that some Christian denomination is going to capture the power of the state and, of course, enforce Sunday laws. What I think is that we need to have a type of religious liberty concept that encourages us to put our own personal values into the public square, and I think that is not a violation of church and state. It's actually a way for us to take the church into the community and be part of the larger state discussion.
I would actually agree with you on that 100%. I think when we talk about issues, I think that's great. I think the problem with separation of church and state is because when it becomes viewed as a promoting political parties or agendas or specific candidates, that causes problems. One of the things that I really appreciated the opportunity to be part of when I was at the NAD, I was involved in pushing legislation called Fairness for All. And that was multi-denominational, but also different non-religious groups. And it was pushing rights for the LGBT community, but at the same time trying to protect rights of the religious community, where we said it doesn't have to be an either or. This is a win-win situation for everybody. One of the things we talked about is when that legislation was going up, and it never got voted. But what it did do was it provided us the opportunity to sit in the room with other faith-based groups and other non-faith-based groups and actually have a conversation about a human rights issue, not a political conversation, about a human rights conversation about, at that time in 39 states, you could be fired from your job or lose access to public housing if you identified as LGBT. And that needed to have protection. But at the same time, religious organizations need to have some level of religious protection for itself. There needs to be a balance where both can be protected. And that we felt that legislation provided a balance for that. But, for 3 years, I sat on boards and I was part of conversations all over this country and helping promote this legislation, but also conversations that helped craft that legislation and helping getting it put in front of Congress. That was a really important thing to me. Because even though I don't identify as LGBT and our church has a strong stance when it comes to that issue, I know a lot of people that have good friends, I have family members and everything, but it comes down to a human rights issue. Should you be fired? That's not a religious conversation. That's not a religious thing. If you have a public job, not a religious-based job, you have a public job and that entity can fire you or you can lose access to public housing just because of your sexual orientation, that's not right. And we knew that some members had a problem with that, but we felt like we needed to be part of a broader conversation. We're going to protect our interests, but also protect the interests of someone, even though I may disagree with them at the same time, that's valid and that's a good place to be. And it put us in the public sphere. And I would tell you, when I left to come teach, that's probably the thing I missed the most for those conversations. And it was funny when Adventist colleagues found out I was going to leave to go teach. They were like, "Why would you go do that? Why would you leave the church administration to go teach and everything?" When I went to this Fairness for All group and I shared with them, this is going to be my last meeting, I'm going to teach at one of our universities. Overwhelmingly, it was positive support. Wow, that's really great. Good for you. What a wonderful thing. You're really giving of yourself to others and the next generation and stuff and everything. I got more positive affirmation from that group than I did from my own colleagues. They're like, "Why would you leave? It's such a big cut in pay and everything." But the affirmation I got from non-Adventists on making that switch really I really appreciated that. And I made some really good friendships while I was there that I would not have made if we had not stepped out and participated in that conversation.
Well, that's great to hear that. And I think it's important for folks to step away from professional life sometimes and dip into the teaching world, in part because it can bring a lot of real world experience, but it's incredibly fulfilling to see those light bulbs go on in the classroom.
Yeah. Yes. Off and on. Yes.
Yeah. As we're wrapping up here, I thought maybe we could just kind of maybe talk about one part of Adventism that we think lends itself to a productive body politic, to some sort of discussion. I'll go first. I think, number one, you were just talking about human rights, and I do think that there's something about our traditional views of the Sabbath and our desire to protect that allows us to get into a much larger global conversation about human rights that at a practical level turns into humanitarian action, but I think at an intellectual level is kind of live or die for our planet if we're serious about kind of understanding each other. So I think our sense of the Sabbath beyond individual obedience gets us, and the importance of gathering in community, but just saying this is something that we have always felt like we're not part of the majority, and that gives us empathy for minorities around the world. So that's a beautiful part of Adventism.
It is a beautiful part of Adventism, and but we tend to view the Sabbath oftentimes as isolationists. Yeah. We isolate ourselves from the world.
Remnant technology is probably
where we take the peculiar people thing a little bit too far sometimes. I tell a story in my ethics class about when I first got out of school and I was in Sacramento, your backyard, and I got called by Macy's, the department store in town, and they wanted me to come take pictures of Julia Child, who at the time was Food Network before Food Network existed, right? And I said, "Great. What are the dates?" They tell me the dates. And I said, "Let me get back to you." And I looked at the calendar and it was on a Sabbath. And I'm just out of school and I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? The ethical dilemma. I mean, here's a great opportunity with a big department store. Once you get your foot in the door, that's all you need is that opportunity to get your foot in the door and stuff. And I called them back and said, I appreciate the opportunity, but unfortunately I'm a Seventh-day Adventist and I don't work on Saturdays. And they said, all right, well, never mind. And I didn't get the job, of course. And had a couple other opportunities over the years, but nothing as big as that. And it always bothered me because at one point in the mid-90s, I was struggling with my business and stuff and everything. And then one of my corporate clients called me up and said, hey, we'd like to hire you in a couple weeks on a Saturday. We do this thing called Christmas in April where all the employees volunteer their time. This is a large company of 3,000 employees. We volunteer our time to go in the community and do community-based projects to fix up homes and clean up the community and these types of things. We'd like to hire you to take pictures of that to document it for our human resources. And I said, yeah, let me call you back. And I thought about it, and I was reminded back to the Julia Child thing. And I was like, oh man, here's another opportunity. Not as big as Macy's, but still, it's an important client. And I thought about it and prayed about it, and I called them back and I said, so here's my answer. I'd love to come take pictures, but I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. I don't work on Saturdays. So I'm willing to volunteer my time just like your employees are, because I believe what you're doing is bettering the community. So I will come and take pictures for free. I'll donate my time. I'll donate the expenses. I'll pay for the film and everything, because I really believe in what you're doing. And they said, wait, you're willing to do that? And I go, yeah, because I value you and I value what you're doing in the community. I think it's a wonderful thing. So that'll be my Sabbath, will be helping the community. And about 3 months later, they offered me a full-time job. And it took about 6 months to work out. And after I got hired full-time, my vice president came up to me and said, you got a minute? And I said, yeah, of course. And she said, do you want to know why you hired me? I said, because of my charming personality. And she said,
That can't be
well,
true.
yes, but she goes, no, what you did when you donated your time, we were shocked by that. And we said, if this person has such ethics and such values that they're willing to give up income to help better the community, we want an employee like that in our organization. And I tell my students there are ways for standing up for what you believe in, but also standing up for helping others at the same time. And because of that, I got a job that I worked there for 5 years, and it greatly impacted my professional life. And everything I learned there impacts my working for the church and now teaching. So it was a way to honor God, but at the same time, not just isolate myself and say, no, I can't help out. And I think there are ways we can do that as a church, where we stop looking in the mirror and looking at ourselves. We look at others and say, okay, what would Christ do in this situation? Christ would step out and would help people. There's lots of stories about those types of things. But I think as a church, as a denomination, we need not to be afraid to speak out on issues. But it's the endorsement of people that sometimes get wrapped around those issues, get wrapped around those politicians when they shouldn't be. And you just separate the politician from the issues and just focus on the issues. And that the endorsement as the church or as leaders in the church can be a bad thing, but we need not be afraid as individuals to get involved when it comes to the betterment of others.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that story, and that's really inspiring. The fact that you went back to talking about individuals versus the issues, I do want to just reiterate. The thing is, we are voting. I mean, people can choose not to vote, but we vote for people in positions. And I think that's an interesting thing that we want to think about, because we're also talking about who has the power or who has the influence, to use your word, on a campus or in a pulpit. Those are also people in positions of influence. And so there's a kind of discomfort about the conversation of power and influence here that I know we want to end here soon, but I want to take a moment with, because how those issues actually get handled is by people with influence. And so we ultimately, I think it's avoiding the last step of that question. What are my values? Do I want to see them enacted? Who am I going to choose to do that? And so I think it's kind of stopping short of that real question, which is we have to make difficult choices as humans, like your story indicated.
Yeah.
It's not always easy. It had a great happy ending to it, but I do think that we have to recognize that we have to be comfortable with imperfect choices sometimes. Yeah. And also we have to recognize there are really bad choices. And I think this election, this election offers us, I know every election seems like it's, do or die, but I do think that this offers us some really clear moral choices. And the story you just told is great because you made some choices that actually hurt you, professionally for a while, and then those same values then paid off for you. And I think that we have to recognize sometimes it's painful to have a difficult conversation about not voting for Donald Trump, but in fact that will pay off for America down the road, where we will all be at least a little bit better off and perhaps avoid some real disasters.
And I think there's ways of speaking to issues per se that, you don't have to come out and say, okay, I'm going to vote for this candidate. But I think these issues are important. These are things that impact society as a whole. This impacts me as a Christian. This impacts how I relate to other people as a Christian and other groups as a Christian. Those are things we can speak to without coming out and saying, FYI, you should vote for this person. I think it's better to say, focus on these issues. As a Christian and as an Adventist, I'm concerned about these issues, and let those issues inform the voter. But every Adventist member should be involved in the political process by your vote does matter, no matter what state you live in, whether you're in a swing state or not.
Yeah, well, you're lucky in Michigan. Your vote will matter. Mine,
Yeah.
I'm going to vote.
It's predetermined
on principle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's been great talking with you, Dan. Thanks for taking the time to.
You bet. Good to talk to you.
Conversation. We hope it's a blessing for folks who are listening.